This podcast is brought to you by our friends at Linode. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Linode has the pricing, support, and scale you need to take your project to the next level. Get started on Linode today by going to linode.com/sustain. Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source and code in the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are the bodies buried? How can we dig them up and have some? That's just going to keep going. Okay. Today on this podcast, we have a few panelists. We have Justin Dorfman.
Hello, everyone.
Pia.
Hello.
Eric.
Hey, everybody.
I don't know Gunner's last name, but Gunner.
Hello.
And me. That's actually all the panelists. And we have, just because we love making them feel totally outnumbered, one guest, Nathan Schneider.
Hi.
It's great to have you on here. So Nathan is a professor at CU Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder, as opposed to other places called Boulder in the world. I don't know where they are. Can you tell us a bit about what you do there?
Yeah. So glad to be here. I'm a professor of media studies at CU Boulder, and I run a new little outfit called the Media Enterprise Design Lab, where we work on projects related to democratic ownership and governance for media companies, online platforms, the internet, social movements, just like trying to slip democracy into places where it's absent wherever we can.
That's awesome. That's really, really cool. And also probably very needed. You also run a thing called social.coop, co-op, one of them?
Co-op, yeah. Not the chicken kind, the kind that involves shared ownership and governance. So social.coop is one of many such little projects where, in this case, we run a Mastodon instance, Mastodon being like the kind of open source, non-Twitter, Twitter-like thing that is part of the Fediverse. So, that kind of broader range of open social media platforms. And we run it as a cooperative. That's why the top level domain is .coop. And so the people who use the tool are also kind of co-owners and co-running it. And we do our money stuff on Open Collective as well, which has been great.
That's really cool. So you're one of these rare people who isn't in a CS department, but knows a lot about what's going on. You're running Zoom right now on a Linux machine. Can you tell us how you got to where you are?
Well, I guess it's that stuff. I mean, computer stuff for me started when I was in a band in high school. I had a band with my next door neighbor, and he was really good at computers. He ended up becoming he's an engineer at a big company that you've heard of. And he, at the time, was a tinker. And when we were building like websites for our band, he taught me how to like copy other people's websites and then put them on our GeoCities or AngelFire websites. And then I did actually a year as a computer science major, and it turned out to be, in college, something I was really, really bad at. I realized that I was working really, really hard just to get by. Everybody else was barely working because they already knew all of it. And they were just going through it they'd learned it all when they were 13, and they were just going through it to get the degree. And so I promptly switched to religion and have been studying culture ever since, and worked as a reporter for a long time, and kind of a half reporter, half activist. But all along, I've kind of kept habits that I started in that year, which was involved like just trying to use as many open tools as I can to just enjoy the life of the commons. And, since then I've been writing in Emacs all the time, which is in the terminal, which even Emacs people think is stupid, right? I've come to love using tools that are built by communities and interacting with those communities. I'm not a developer. I don't submit, bug patches, but I can submit bug reports. And I just love the interaction and the conversation and the experience of being part of these communities. If I'm going to be on computers all day, I'd much rather it, be with others rather than kind of interacting constantly with these kind of robotic corporations somewhere else.
I love that. And I think you would be a developer, actually. I mean, that's a loose term, so I wouldn't shy away from that. especially if you use Emacs. I'm a Vim guy, so Emacs is just foreign as hell. One of the questions I have is that you like the phrase the tyranny of openness. Can you describe what you mean by the tyranny of openness when you use it? Because that seems to be the opposite of what you just said of liking to be in communities and talking to people and helping out.
Yeah. So it's, I guess, another annoying habit I have is that when I love something, I like to criticize it. And so this phrase of the tyranny of openness it's a reference to a famous essay from the early 70s in the kind of feminist community of the Bay Area, The Tyranny of Structurelessness, right? Which is a critique of these kind of open horizontal groups, that these consciousness raising circles that were popular among feminists in the world that the author Jo Freeman inhabited. And these were, they would talk about having no leaders and being horizontal, being structureless. And she raises this critique that when you claim to be structureless, you are often importing in a tyranny, and there's going to be a tyranny lurking in the background. And this is an essay that has kind of recurred in the Silicon Valley context in tech. It's had a long afterlife. And the tyranny of openness, which is a phrase I use in some recent writing, where I use feminist frames in particular to look at debates going on in open source, is a way of just posing a challenge to open source about ways in which the movement has kind of neglected certain tyrannies that are arising within it, whether it's this acceptance of benevolent dictators for life in many projects, whether it's being kind of parasitic on the economics of the corporations surrounding projects rather than having projects run their own economics, or ethics. There's kind of a growing call in the ongoing techlash among software developers and others to be more intentional about how our tools are being used. And all these things kind of amount to this ongoing debate and perhaps crisis in open source. And I was trying to find a frame that helps us understand where this all is coming from. And I found some of those same feminist traditions that Jo Freeman was working through to be useful in understanding what's going on here.
I read your article, and that's why I reached out right away. I had to have you on the show. Now, here's what I've been thinking about. The Linux kernel, Python up until recently, Ruby, curl. They're all run by BDFLs. They're installed on billions of devices. Tell me, why is that working? And in the future, how should projects at that scale work?
Well, it's a great question about, and to me, there's this kind of open research question, which is like, why is this so normal, right? And I don't think I have a definitive answer, but I do have part of an answer. And here's another little catchphrase I've been working on in my research, which is implicit feudalism. And this is an argument around the way in which the tools we use implicitly lure us into like super feudalistic structures. And I've done this kind of historical dive that, goes back to, BBS systems and these moments where people are describing what it's like to be running your BBS in your house. And they would think of the community as like a group of house guests that they are literally hosting. And from there, all the ways in which the tools that we use for online collaboration and community have these implicit biases in them that steer us toward very feudalistic practices. And when I compare, for instance, like something like the structure of Linux to like my mother's garden club, which has like a constitution and elections and, a board and, very clear responsibilities. And, it's kind of like, we have a lot of catching up to do to that garden club. And maybe there are things we wouldn't want about that, but still there's some sophistication there that a lot of our open source projects lack. Consider a case like Git, if I can be allowed to get a little geeky here. Like Git is really interesting because it creates power vacuums. It doesn't really decide what the canonical, branch is. It has this kind of beautiful intrinsic decentralization. But as a result of that, it relies on either the mailing list that it's being run on, whoever controls the mailing list, and mailing lists are very feudal. You're an admin or you're not, and admins can silence people and, have incredible despotic control over voice, right? Or a GitHub repo, which again replicates these these kind of admin permissions logics. Git platforms don't have the tools to run, something like My Mother's Garden Club. You could ad hoc it, like Wikipedia or as you mentioned, Python is now doing, but it requires extra work. And so it's made me wonder if we had tools that had some cool governance stuff built in, would so many of our projects be structured around this kind of logic? I'm not sure about the answer, but that's a kind of question I'm asking now.
I can't help but draw parallels with, direct democracy and representative democracy, and this idea that if everyone, this utopia that we can all have agency and participate and vote and have equal access at the end is also forming this kind of leaderless soup where the loudest voices are always winning the debate, and there is no structure at all that organizes power. Because at the end of the day, what we need are structures in place that help us manage the power that comes with creativity, that comes with production, that comes with a community. That is fascinating. What would you, in your wildest dreams, what would a structure like that look like? What tools should we be building? What do they look like?
Okay, so to me, again, an open question that I'm really interested in the answer to, and maybe there isn't an answer, but I think of two models. One would be something like Creative Commons, right, which is a really successful kind of toolkit for licensing, right? But you have very few options, right? You have a handful of very well-developed options. And okay, so you're starting a new project, you want to license your stuff, you pick one of those, very few vetted options, and, the communities just kind of crystallize around certain models that really seem to work. Another approach would be to open the floodgates. And so I've been working with this group of scholars. We call ourselves a meta governance project. Scholars, practitioners, researchers, blockchain, basement dwellers, all these things. And what we're exploring with that would be a much more, and by the way, Lawrence Lessig, who started Creative Commons, is kind of involved in that as well, is trying to imagine what it would be like for people to actually build their own governance tools and to create a kind of modular environment where it becomes the WordPress plugin, library, right? Where you're just drawing in things that other people have built for other purposes, and you can hack them together into a governance toolkit that makes sense for your group. And then we see a kind of acceleration and innovation and creativity and playfulness as different groups try out different stuff. I'm not sure which, in some ways it can be, I find people who like governance and rules and processes and structures have a kind of distorted view of the world because they don't recognize the way in which most people don't care about those things at all, and that those things actually have a violence to them and, destroy culture and destroy community and all this stuff. So I have to enter this conversation with a recognition that my biases as someone who likes this stuff are immense, and I have to be very wary of them and just try things out and and see what the world does, see what I can learn from regular people who are less kind of distorted in their vision. I don't know. I mean, which one what would be useful for you? What would you want to play with governance, or would you want it to get it over with?
I can answer that with a follow-on question, which is I'm curious. You talk about governance as modular assembly. I mean, I continue to dream of governance design patterns where you think about outcomes or equity or agency that you seek to animate based on community values or norms. And when you say pull this governance module and that governance module in, that just sounds like Franken governance. I'm curious if the notion of governance design patterns is something that's part of your meta governance conversation.
Yeah, and it's been one. We've tried a bunch of different attempts to create typologies, right? So do we start at the mechanism level, or do you start at the general level? Do you start with Aristotle's typologies of oligarchy and democracy and so forth? There are all these different levels at which you might address the question. One difference, for instance, I think in terms of a pattern that could be useful or that's been useful for me is governance that is optimized for decision as opposed to action. I've seen that difference play out in some of the blockchain protocols. For instance, some really focus on like getting people into doing something. Some people, or some of them, really fixate on like, how do we make this decision? And I think there's even a class dimension there. I had a mentor, an activist mentor, is always like, the difference between, a middle class activist and a working class activist, because the middle class activist is going to be obsessed with decisions because that's what they're trained to do. They're trained to, organize decisions on behalf of the owning class, right? Whereas working class people, are taught from childhood to do stuff, be competent, get the job done. And so, there's a lot of interesting dynamics there. One, for instance, attempt that I made is to collect some of these patterns is a little directory called Democratic Mediums that was kind of a forerunner to some of this work. And it was an attempt, actually came out of like being at this kind of blockchain-ish conference and seeing this longing that so many people had for like the one true voting system, once we get this voting system, all of our governance problems will go away because this is the correct one, right? And it just, as I heard this, I kept thinking of like all the stuff, I thought back to like any governance process I've been involved in, any like political news I've ever read, and thinking about things like friendship, and eloquence and, all the pieces of those processes that are so essential. And, one more thing too is, this goes back to that tyranny of structurelessness. One thing you see, if you've ever, played around with some of these, distributed governance protocols, these blockchain projects, what you find is they've got their tool and it's got the beautiful voting system in it, right? But then you realize that most of the time they're not on the tool. They're on Telegram and it's exhausting. And often there are people whose work is totally undervalued who are like making old-fashioned newsletters, trying to keep track of like what everybody's talking about. They're reinventing in the background and not admitting it, all the stuff that like traditional offline governance has done. And then they're pretending that the technology is running the show, right? And it's often very gendered too. So anyway.
It's like XKCD 927, the standards situation. There are 14 competing standards. Oh my God, we got to make a standard that is going to cover everything situation. There's 15 competing standards. So that's what you got me thinking.
Yeah, I appreciate it's how engineers think. They want the engineered solution, but politics is very good at resisting engineering.
A lot of what you're saying is very fascinating to me, particularly the split between classes with action and decision making. That's something which I've been noticing a lot, but haven't had that framework to couch things. So as soon as you said that, all sorts of explosions happened in my mind. One of the things I'm really curious about is what's the split in coders, like on a normal GitHub project, between people who could be classified as doers versus people who would be classified as decision makers, and how does that work directly into governance? Because there are differences in where people learn how to code. And I'm not saying that, someone who grows up in X amount of income is going to always be a doer or whatever. I mean, these are lenses upon which we look at things. But I wonder, just because I'm personally very curious, have you ever looked into that, like inside a project, who actually does the things and who tries to say who does the things, like who makes decisions, et cetera?
I haven't, but it does remind me of that, the experience I described earlier, going to computer science school, right? And realizing that everybody is, learned it themselves. And that reminds me of, whenever I think of that, whenever I see a coding school or somebody's ideology, somebody professing this logic that, if everybody just learned how to code, if we took all the, homeless people and taught them how to code, that would solve homelessness, right? It's just a reminder that there is this kind of, proletarianized code, where, people get taught to learn a certain thing. And then there is the kind of culture of hacker communities and practice, and that is different from just like learning how to write in a certain language. And, I wonder if things would fall along those lines where, people who are learning in a very schooled environment are missing certain cultural lessons that are, that come through class, that come through other dimensions that end up reinforcing certain kinds of hierarchies. I don't know. It's something I haven't studied, but I'd be curious about, more about the kinds of experiences you all have had in those kinds of line drawing.
On the video, you can't see it, listeners, but Gunnar just took his glasses off and on, and it reminded me in particular of Zizek's favorite movie, which is what the Body Snatchers or something, where there's these glasses you can put on. And once you see them, you see the world as it really is, and everything is ideology, basically. So like every advertisement is like, you're not perfect, go buy more. And every person is like a skeleton. And it's a really fascinating look at like, what is philosophy and how do you look at the world? So definitely that the hacker versus code school split is one I've been conscious of for a long time, especially as the JavaScript community, as we know it today with Node, has been so fundamentally altered by like a core cabal of people who were hackers in like the Oakland area like 5-10 years ago. And it's been so interesting watching these people go forth and make all these things. And now everyone else learning JavaScript, but still using the tools that just this small group created without having to go to code school, just sitting around in some various maker spaces hacking at things. So that's been really fun for me.
And that's another example of this sort of thing, where these of how tyrannies arise, right? These kind of happy tyrannies, right? Where a group of people does something really cool, they assumptions and practice, certain logics into what they're doing that then are kind of broadcast and democratized, quote, democratized, made apparently available, but there's something missing. There's something that's not being communicated, in that democratized version of JavaScript in this case, of the culture underlying it, all these pieces. And that's what Joe Freeman was getting at, that there is a text and a subtext, and the subtext is often what's driving our communities if we are not clear about where power lies.
Nathan, can I get you to talk a little bit about like platform cooperativism as a critique of open source? I'm just curious. That in my mind is, I'm just very curious about how you are thinking about this.
Yeah, so platform cooperativism is this kind of network project community, like some people say movement, I'm not quite there yet, that I've been involved in for some years now, which is about bringing like old-fashioned cooperative business models into the online economy, good old, democratic ownership and governance, like your credit union, like, the electric co-op that brought electricity to my grandfather's farm, in the New Deal, all this stuff. And so the idea is like, we've got deep accountability problems in the online economy, bad labor practices, bad data practices. Okay, what if the participants, users were workers, were owners? Might that address some of these deep challenges? And so I work with startups and so forth that are interested in trying to build cooperative models. And some of them succeed, some of them don't. So in the course of this, of course, there are a lot of people in that network are really interested in open source and free software. And, there's a lot of elective affinities. Open source and free software are cooperative, in a looser sense, very much. It's all about people cooperating together. But there's an interesting difference that gets highlighted there, and it often comes up, for instance, in an exchange I had with Richard Stallman, where he was like, I don't care if, like the drivers own the company and they get paid more if they're running client-side apps that they don't control and the code isn't all open and so forth, right? So there's a disconnect. What do you prioritize? Do you prioritize, the economic flows or the information flows? Open source is generally prioritize the information flows. And also, one thing that open source has really neglected is the collective management of non-code resources. So stuff like money, and this is where Open Collective, works, is what resources does the GitHub repo not, at least until recently, support the management of? What are we neglecting? And the argument is too much our commons have been poached by extractive companies. A classic example is, Linux into Android, where you have this open source code base that's the basis of the most powerful corporate surveillance tool ever invented. And so is that really what we want? And I've just this week, I've been in conversation with developers of an open source platform that is also a kind of cooperative network around the world. And, Microsoft is stepping in and forking their code and making money off of it. And they're like, wait, what's going on? This is like not in line with our values, but it is in line with their licenses, right? So there's a sense in which the license has enabled a kind of exploitation, a kind of tyranny of structurelessness that cooperative networks are designed to avoid. They're designed to make the cooperative idea is to put assets, resources under the control of the participants and to make sure they're accountable to those participants. And meanwhile, the open source world kind of has some features that allow and actually nourish this kind of extractive process. So the critique here is, we need to talk about ownership. We need to talk about resources, and often I found myself as, like open source geeky as I am, defending cooperative projects that decide not to use open code because actually the open licenses contravene the goals of the cooperative and the best interests of its users. So it's again, it enters into that critique and some of the big debates happening around open source right now and licensing issues is, how do we deal with cases where Amazon is, essentially exploiting the labor of the contributing community? How do we create a framework that creates a commons not just of intellectual property and code, but a commons of, a kind of full stack commons?
Yeah, it's sort of like a double-edged sword because, with the open source licenses as they are defined now, they allow Amazon and Microsoft to do this. And we shouldn't, as much as it's like, come on, guys, seriously. But that doesn't matter. They're technically not doing anything wrong. It's just like a moral issue, I suppose. So, yeah, I mean, it's such a crazy problem because, it's on one side, it's like, oh, if you're $1 billion company, then you can't do that. And then the license is like, well, of course you can because there's no discrimination. So I don't know. I love you on this show because it gets my mind moving. It's very interesting and fascinating.
Well, these are questions that I hope the movement will take seriously, and they're questions that are becoming more and more urgent. And a lot of the people at the center of it are kind of batting them off and rather than engage. And they're saying, we've addressed those, we've thought about these, but a lot of the things that people are so deeply worried about in tech, actually do go back to open source licenses, and when people are worried about surveillance and exploitation, it's open source code at the heart of that. What do we do about that? What's the response? There has to be some response.
Well, there's a real world example of that is with Germany, how they went from open source back to proprietary. Now they're going back to open source, I believe. So yeah, I mean, it's just, I guess it just comes down to who's in charge, what risk they want to take on. And yeah, it's just.
And well, another thing, I'm glad you mentioned the case of Germany, right? Because we have to remember, the role that the public can play here. This isn't just a private game, right? And the internet itself, was in a sense, before the term open sourced, in part because it was a public investment. And there was this, it could have gone private, right? That was an option. That was a live option. And, there were political forces that, visionary leaders who saw that, okay, that would be a bad idea. There's this other option. And so that these tools just became, available for public use. Another example of this is France right now investing in projects like Nextcloud and Matrix, really, I think, great projects that I use daily. And there's something different when a government is investing in a project than when, a private company is. Often private companies are investing in tools that they can use on the back end, right? But not so much often front-end interfaces, things that will make the tool a competitor. Right? They're very selective about the kinds of investments they want to make in open tools. Whereas governments have a different set of incentives when they invest in open tools. They want to create something that's kind of useful for the public. And I think that's a reminder that we should think, one of the solutions to some of these dilemmas is to, call for increasing public investment in these tools because it will look different from the private investment.
Nathan, can you tell us a little bit about community rule? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is a project. This goes back to we were talking about earlier around governance, and this is a result of my impatience. I talked earlier about this super ambitious project I'm involved in to create computational governance, systems through this meta governance framework, right? But I can't wait for that. So together with my lab, been spinning up this little tool called Community Rule. It's at communityrule.info. And it's a kind of a generator tool for mini constitutions for groups. And, we're thinking about longing for, hoping to serve groups as varied as like the mutual aid networks that are forming around coronavirus, right? That often form without kind of explicit governance agreements, just out of community and passion, but actually now have to work on the long haul and are going to have to make some hard decisions. And also open source projects where, we've got the README file, we've got the contributing file that kind of tells you how to pitch in. We've got the license file that tells the world what it can't do with this stuff. But what about the governance file, right? That says, who makes the decisions, who ultimately accepts the contributions, who does this or that, whatever the important decisions are. And so Community Rule is set up to allow people to publish their little mini rules to the site and share with each other. And already we're seeing people learning from each other. For instance, a group started a temporary benevolent dictator rule where they modified the benevolent dictator, made it explicitly temporary. And then others started borrowing from that language. And it also allows you to export a GitHub ready MD file so that you can insert your governance.md file into your repo. So this is an attempt to start with natural language to experiment with the stuff that hopefully someday our tools will be much better equipped for, to make it so that simple common sense, governance logic is kind of the norm in our communities.
That's fascinating. And I'd love to experiment it with, the collectives and also the relief funds. But also I'm so curious and genuinely kind of interested in seeing, what sort of experiments the other folks are running and what kind of governance, I guess, just what blueprints can we, put together and share knowledge of our governance structure. I love it. It's like sandboxes of innovation for building institutions. That's
absolutely. I'm already learning from what people are putting into it. And I'm just hoping to, to see more of that learning from each other happening.
Great. Thank you for that.
So Nathan, that's about the time we have today. And thank you so much. Before we move on to Spotlight, I want to know, where can people find you? Where can they find your work? Where can they read your books? Where can they get involved? Where can they upload these templates, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so stuff about my work, including like drafts of papers that, several of which I've mentioned here, is at nathanschneider.info, and lots of stuff there, as well as information about my books, like stuff about co-ops. I have a book about Occupy Wall Street, a book about proofs for the existence of God, if you're into that sort of thing. So there's something for everybody. And then also the Community Rule project is communityrule.info. As you can see, I really love .info, top level domains. I don't understand why people don't use them more. Like, we're all just sharing information. It's a great domain. They're cheap.
I love that. I just wish
get a sponsorship from whoever runs these. I don't know.
Yeah, I love that. I just wish that the co-op one had a diaeresis in it, so it wouldn't be pronounced as coop, but you could have the two dots over the second O.
The co-op one is really interesting. It was one of the first top level domains really early on. A rare example of co-ops being on the cutting edge, and they manage it pretty tightly. So you can't, not just anybody can grab one of those domains. You have to legitimately be part of the movement, which is pretty good.
Love that. Speaking of the movement, part of any movement is looking back and shedding light on people who came before us and cool projects that have been part of our story. So this is the time for Spotlight, where we all point out things in the Boston accent that we really love. Justin, what do you got for us?
There's been so much talk about governance in this conversation that we had today. So I want to bring up the Governance Ready Working Group that you can find on sustainoss.org. And check it out.
Also full of people who love governance. You are not alone, Nathan. Not alone. Gunnar.
I've been spending a lot of time thinking about open hardware this past year, and the fact that if we don't pay more attention to open hardware, our open source efforts are for naught. And I've been hanging out with a gathering on open science hardware and just can't shout them out enough. I think they're doing really cool work.
Awesome. Thank you. Pia?
Yeah, so my spotlight today is SaveInternetFreedom.tech. It's a coalition that is trying to save OTF, the Open Technology Fund, from being dismantled by the government and turning the broadcasters into mouthpieces of the current administration. So please join the campaign. Whenever this is released, the campaign is going to still be going. So sign the newsletter or sign the petition, call your representatives and check it out.
Wait, why didn't you get a .info?
I have no idea.
.tech is not where it's at.
Yeah. All right. Sorry.
I'm joking.
Good questions. Eric had to drop off, but I can see from the notes that his spotlight was going to be all-in-one.im, which is an all-in-one messenger. I think harking back to trillion level days when we used to have AIM and ICQ and IRC all in the same boat. Sounds super cool. I miss those tools. So go try out that. My spotlight is for Matthias Boos, who was one of the early hackers I mentioned earlier in Oakland. He just launched GitHub sponsors. He's done a lot of really cool stuff with streams and with torrents and with the P2P web. He's been one of the people who's really inspired me to actually just code more and code often. Highly suggest checking out his sponsors and or his work, which you've probably used at some point if you've done anything on the P2P web, which is super, super cool. Nathan, last but not least, what do you got for us?
I think I'm going to speak for the ethical source movement, which is, a kind of part of this critique of open source, a friendly critique. A group of people want to bring ethics into open source. And one thing that they've just adopted, which I was involved in a bit, was an expectation that groups do practice governance in order to be a kind of ethical project. And it's just a really productive community in terms of a conversation around some of these issues. So if people are interested in getting involved more, do that. I also just have to offer a plug for a local company doing great open source hardware and software, which is System 76. They're making computers, not this one, but the desktops here in Colorado, doing domestic manufacturing, building a great distro of Linux, Op OS, and they're great people. So please, consider what they're doing. And the new Lemur Pro laptop is phenomenal.
Awesome. Thank you. I've also just invited you, Nathan, to the WG-podcast group channel in the Ethical Source Slack, which you can all join because we're thinking about starting up an ethical podcast series.
Oh, awesome.
Either with them or with Sustain. Not sure yet. The conversation is open. Everyone should get involved with Ethical Source. It's super cool. Thank you so much, Nathan. And thank you for coming and talking about all these awesome things. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
This podcast is brought to you by our friends at Linode. With 11 data centers worldwide, including their newest data center in Sydney, Australia, with enterprise-grade hardware, S3-compatible storage options, and their next-generation network, Linode delivers the performance you expect at a price that you don't. Get started on Linode today by going to linode.com/sustain.